One of the most beloved cars in British history almost didn't look the way you remember it. Because the man who designed it hated his own early work so much, he had it sawn clean in half. This is the story of the Morris Minor, a car born out of wartime secrecy, forced compromise, and one designer's sheer stubbornness. And a car that would go on to become the very first British vehicle in history to sell 1 million units, decades before anyone in that wartime workshop could have imagined such a thing. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you'll understand exactly how a car nearly rejected for looking wrong ended up shaping British motoring for the rest of the century. Let's go back to 1942, in the middle of the Second World War. Civilian car production in Britain had been banned outright, every factory redirected toward the war effort. But at Morris Motors, under the direction of managing director Miles Thomas, a young engineer named Alec Issigonis was quietly given permission to start sketching something new, a proper small car for whenever peace finally arrived. The project carried a secret codename, Mosquito, borrowed from the fighter plane. Issigonis worked on it in relative secrecy, developing his ideas alongside a small, trusted team, while the rest of the factory kept churning out munitions. By late 1943, a working prototype was already running in the experimental workshops at Cowley, years before the war had even ended. It's worth knowing that Issigonis almost didn't get this chance at all. He'd joined Morris back in 1936 as a suspension specialist, and it was the company's chief engineer, Vic Oak, who first spotted his talent and pushed him forward for bigger responsibilities. There's also a small piece of continuity worth mentioning. Morris had actually used the name Minor once before, back in 1928, on an earlier small car built to rival the Austin 7. This new 1940s project would eventually inherit that same name, even though the two cars shared almost nothing else in common. Nobody at Morris could have guessed, watching that first prototype roll quietly around the test yard, that it was about to become one of the most successful cars Britain had ever built. Pay attention to this next detail, because it's genuinely remarkable for a small British family car built in the 1940s. Issigonis was openly inspired by the Citroën Traction Avant, a French car he admired deeply, and he borrowed some of its most advanced thinking. Independent front suspension, using torsion bars instead of the old-fashioned leaf springs almost every rival still used. Rack and pinion steering, a genuinely sophisticated setup rarely found on an affordable British car of that era. And the engine itself was mounted well forward, directly over the front wheels, rather than set further back. A placement Issigonis had personally investigated and proven dramatically improved a car's stability and control. There was one more unusual choice too. Issigonis specified 14-inch wheels, noticeably smaller than the 17-inch wheels fitted to the old Morris 8. This car was replacing. Smaller wheels meant more usable cabin space for exactly the same overall footprint. A small decision with a genuinely big payoff for anyone actually sitting inside, and a piece of thinking that would later become a defining trademark of Issigonis's entire design philosophy. Put all of that together, and here's the honest picture. This wasn't just a cheap, cheerful runabout thrown together to fill a gap in the market. It was a genuinely thoughtful piece of engineering, built by a designer who cared deeply about how a car actually felt to drive, not just how cheaply it could be built. There was another modern touch too, easy to overlook today, but genuinely significant at the time. Rather than bolting separate wings and a running board onto a traditional chassis, the way most cars of that era were still built, this new design used a single, welded, one-piece body shell, with its structural strength built directly into that shell itself. It made the whole car lighter, stiffer, and considerably more efficient to manufacture at scale. And that obsession with getting the details right was about to cause one of the most dramatic last-minute decisions in British car design history. Here's the part of this story that should genuinely surprise you, because it sounds almost too dramatic to be true, and yet it's completely real. Not everything went Issigonis's way during development. Under cost pressure, his ambitious flat-4 engine design got scrapped, replaced by a simple, conventional side valve unit borrowed from the older Morris 8. His independent rear suspension idea was cut too, replaced by a cheaper, simpler rigid axle on leaf springs. Issigonis was reportedly furious about those compromises. And when William Morris himself, the company's founder, finally saw an early prototype, he apparently hated it, comparing its appearance to an unflattering, egg-like shape. Issigonis, already frustrated by the engineering cuts he'd been forced to accept, decided he wasn't going to compromise on this too. So, late in development, with the factory already tooling up for production, Issigonis made an extraordinary call. He had the prototype physically cut in half lengthways and ordered a 4-inch strip inserted down the middle to widen the entire car. It genuinely improved both the interior space and the way the proportions looked. But the timing created chaos. Bumpers had already been manufactured to the old, narrower width, so early cars simply had them sawn in half too, with a metal filler plate bolted between the two pieces. The bonnet needed a flat center section, added just to make the geometry work, and even the floor pan required extra panels welded in on either side of the transmission tunnel to accommodate the new width. That flat strip down the middle of the bonnet, still visible on original Morris Minors today, exists purely because one stubborn engineer refused to let a car he believed in look wrong. The Morris Minor finally launched to the public on the 27th of October, 1948, at the Motor Show in Earl's Court, London. Fitted with that carried-over side valve engine, a modest 918 cubic centimeters, it was, by most accounts, about the only genuinely dated part of the whole package. Everything else underneath felt years ahead of its rivals. The reception at that show was genuinely striking. Motor Magazine reported that this humble little Morris managed to overshadow the rest of the stands that year. Remarkable competition considering Jaguar was unveiling its brand new XK120 sports car at that exact same event. Buyers responded immediately. Production, originally planned at just 400 cars a week, had to be ramped up to 600, almost right away, to keep up with orders. And here's a detail worth knowing. Government export regulations in that period meant the vast majority of early production had to be shipped abroad rather than sold at home, reaching 90% of total output by 1951. If you wanted one for yourself in Britain during those early years, you sometimes had to wait, watching brand new miners get loaded onto ships bound for markets overseas before a single one reached your local dealer. The range kept expanding too. A 4-door saloon joined the lineup in 1950, and the practical wood-framed Traveller Estate arrived in 1953, with its distinctive ash timber frame forming the rear half of the body. A genuine callback to older coach-building traditions, alongside panel van and pickup truck versions for tradesmen who needed something more work-focused. Then, in 1952, the Minor received a proper upgrade. It gained a new A-Series engine, originally designed by Austin for its own rival, the Austin A30, and suddenly available to Morris once the two companies merged into the newly formed British Motor Corporation. 4 years later, in 1956, the car evolved further still, becoming the Minor 1000, with a larger 948 cubic centimeter engine, and, at long last, a modern curved one-piece windscreen replacing the old, split two-piece design. A further update followed in 1962, bumping the engine out to 1,098 cubic centimeters, enough to push the little car to a genuine 77 miles an hour, alongside a refreshed dashboard and updated lighting. And here's a detail that surprises even some long-time fans. The Minor's underpinnings quietly lived on under two entirely different badges too, the Riley 1.5 and the Wolseley 1500. Upmarket siblings that shared the same humble floor pan underneath their more formal styling. The growth curve tells its own story too. In its first full year on sale, 1949, roughly 28,500 Minors were built. By 1953, that annual figure had nearly doubled, climbing past 53,000. This wasn't a slow-burning niche success. It was a genuine accelerating phenomenon, gathering pace year after year. This is exactly the kind of story this channel loves digging into. The everyday vehicles that quietly earn their place in people's lives through pure, stubborn engineering excellence. If you're enjoying this one, now's a great time to hit subscribe so you don't miss what we uncover next. And down in the comments, tell me, did your family ever own a Morris Minor, or do you remember one from your street growing up? Drop a comment below, hit like if this is bringing back memories, and share it with a friend who'd appreciate this kind of story. Now, here's where this story reaches a genuinely historic moment. In February of 1961, the Morris Minor became the very first British car in history to sell over 1 million units. Not the first popular car, the actual, documented, verified first. No British manufacturer had ever reached that number before with a single model. And in a detail that feels almost too neat to be a coincidence, Fiat's own small car, the 600, reportedly crossed that exact same 1-to-million milestone in Italy during that very same month. Two very different countries, two very different small cars, both quietly proving that the formula of affordable, practical, well-engineered transport for ordinary families genuinely worked, wherever you built it. To mark the achievement, Morris built something genuinely special. 350 commemorative Minors, finished in a distinctive lilac paint with white leather interiors, one for every single Morris dealership across the United Kingdom. Each one carried a modified badge reading Minor 1 million instead of the usual model name, a small but deliberate touch that made every dealer feel like part of the milestone. And here's a detail that genuinely surprised me digging into this. The actual 1 millionth car itself, the real one, was donated as a competition prize to raise money for a journalists' union charity supporting widows and orphans. Morris also built a special celebratory version for London's Great Ormond Street Hospital for sick children. That one, remarkably, was made entirely out of cake. Think about that for a second. A car that started life as a wartime engineering compromise, forced changes, a scrapped engine, a prototype literally sawn in half in frustration, had become such a beloved fixture of British life that people were baking it into a cake for children in hospital. But the real, lasting impact of this car goes even deeper than the sales numbers suggest, and it has everything to do with what its designer went on to build next. Here's the detail that ties this entire story together, and it's the part most retrospectives leave out completely. Alec Issigonis didn't stop working after the Minor became a success. He carried every hard-won lesson from this car, maximizing interior space, obsessing over proportions, refusing to accept a compromise that felt wrong, straight into his next major project. In 1959, barely more than a decade after the Minor first launched, Issigonis unveiled the car that would define his entire legacy, the Mini. The Mini borrowed directly from ideas the Minor had already tested in the real world: small wheels to maximize cabin space, a relentless focus on genuine usability over flashy styling, and a designer's stubborn refusal to let good enough be good enough. Critics at the time doubted the Mini could even be built profitably at such a low price point. It went on to sell over 2 million units by 1969 alone, becoming, alongside the Minor, one of the two vehicles most responsible for Issigonis's name being recognized by ordinary people on the street, not just car enthusiasts. So here's the honest, underappreciated truth. The Morris Minor isn't just a beloved car in its own right, it's the actual working blueprint for everything Issigonis achieved afterward. Without the lessons forced out of him during the Minor's difficult, compromise-filled development, including that dramatic decision to physically saw a prototype in half rather than accept a shape he didn't believe in, there may never have been a Mini at all. It's a genuinely rare thing in engineering history, one person's early frustrations directly shaping the single most influential small car of the following decade. Most designers get one great idea in a career, if they're lucky. Issigonis got two, and the second one only exists because of everything the first one taught him. Of course, even a car this beloved couldn't stay in production forever. The convertible Tourer version was the first to go, discontinued in 1969. The saloon followed not long after, finally wound down in 1971, while the Traveller Estate and commercial variants held on for a little while longer, into that same final year. Production was replaced on the very same Cowley assembly lines by the Morris Marina, a completely different kind of car for a completely different era of the British motor industry, built around simpler, more conventional engineering rather than the miner's genuinely innovative underpinnings. By the time the last miner rolled off the line, the model had been in continuous production for 23 years, spanning 3 distinct series, and had ultimately sold more than 1.6 million units in total. 23 years, 3 separate design series. Assembly plants not just in Britain, but in Australia, Ireland, New Zealand, South Africa, Malaysia, and Malta, built from complete knockdown kits, shipped out to be assembled locally. A car that began life as a secret wartime sketch, nearly rejected outright for looking wrong, had genuinely gone on to motorize a significant chunk of the world. Not bad at all, for a design its own founder once compared to an egg. So here's what I want you to take away from all of this. Sometimes the most important decision in a project isn't the clever idea you had at the very beginning. It's the stubborn refusal, late in the process, when everything's already supposedly locked in, to accept something that just doesn't feel right yet. Issigonis could have let that narrow, oddly proportioned prototype go to production. Nobody would have blamed him. Instead, he had it sawn in half and fixed it properly, whatever the cost or the chaos that decision created. If your family ever owned a Morris Minor, or a Traveller with that distinctive wood-framed rear end, or if you simply remember one rounding a corner on your street growing up, you were looking at a genuinely significant piece of British engineering history, built by a man who refused to settle for close enough, even when everyone around him had already moved on. And if you've ever been tempted to ship something you weren't quite happy with, just because the deadline was close, or the cost of fixing it felt too high, this story is worth remembering. The car that became Britain's first million seller only happened because somebody was stubborn enough to demand it be right, even at the very last moment. That kind of stubbornness rarely feels convenient in the moment. It usually only looks brilliant afterward, once the results speak for themselves. If this brought back a memory, or taught you something new today, do me a favor. Hit subscribe, so this channel can keep bringing you the real stories behind the machines that quietly shaped everyday British life, the ones that rarely get the full credit they earned. Drop a comment and tell me what stuck with you most, whether it's the story of the prototype being sawn in half, or the fact that a millionth miner was literally baked into a cake. Hit like if you enjoyed this one, and if you know somebody who'd appreciate this kind of story, an old miner owner, a lifelong car enthusiast, anybody who loves this kind of hidden history, go ahead and send it their way. There are more stories like this one coming, the cars that quietly earned Britain's affection the hard way. I'll see you in the next one.